So I've read the materials that you sent, and I may ask you some questions that duplicate them somewhat. I'm as much interested in your thoughts and motivations, sort of that build around those events that happened.
Mhm.
So, to begin with, I'd just like to understand. My understanding is you're a peace activist. You became your activities initially had to do with that, sensibility, if you will. I mean, is that fair that you began this engagement from that point of view?
Yeah, sort of. I remember when Alexander Haig was Secretary of State under Reagan, he made a speech in which he said, "It may be time to fire a nuclear warning shot over the bow of Europe." That's a direct quote from that guy.
Yeah.
And, so at the time I was on a speaking tour with Robert Mueller. Does that name strike a bell? He was the Undersecretary General of the United Nations, then became president of the Peace University in Costa Rica. And
Okay.
he was an incredible soul. And we got to talking about Alexander Haig and the threat of nuclear war. And he said, "I know the Russians really well. I think they would enjoy working with you. Why don't you invite yourself over?" So I sent a...
What year was this now?
That would have been 82.
82.
And
Okay.
so I sent a letter to the UN, the Soviet mission to the United Nations, suggesting that I wanted to go over with my wife, and I didn't get a response. So I resent the letter by certified mail. I got an immediate phone call. I realized these guys don't like to be caught, right?
Right.
So we went over.
So what did you say in that letter? Why did you tell them you wanted to come?
My wife and I were working on a very interesting piece of art, which eventually became posters and coloring books. It's called Peace Trek. It was the evolution of the arms race into a peaceful world.
Okay.
And we were conducting workshops all over the United States and Canada, and I wanted input from the Russians.
Oh, okay. Okay. And was this your own initiative, or were you
Yeah.
part of an organization?
No, it was just mom and pop. That's it.
Okay. All right. It was social entrepreneurship.
Yeah. And so we hired a woman from the Esalen Institute to be a Russian speaker, to be our guide and translator. We didn't trust the in-tourist guide we would be assigned.
Right.
An American. And so we went over, and it was on that very first trip that we were introduced to Joseph Golden, who changed our life, basically, because he, one quick story, Joseph introduced me to a guy named Boris Rauschenbach, who was the head of the Soviet rocket program at that time. And it was also an incredibly gifted soul who was writing a book about the perspectives of Cezanne. Anyway, he was in the hospital when I met him, had a lung infection. And Joseph told me that, what you don't know about Boris, he also sent back the first photographs of the far side of the moon. He wasn't ordered to do that. He was curious. And since he had rockets, he decided to do that. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I happen to have in my briefcase an audio cassette of Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. And I gave it to Boris.
Fantastic.
This is how things happen, right?
Yeah.
And he said, well, what would you like to do here in Russia? And I said, well, I actually have with me a Tandy Radio Shack Model 80 computer. I'd like to set up an email link between the Soviet Union and the United States. And he said, well, what I'd like to do then is introduce you to a guy who can help you. So he sent me to a guy named Boris Naumov at the Academy of Sciences, who was the head of the Institute for Informatic Problems. That's what it was called.
Okay.
So I went to see Naumov, and I said, all right, my first question is, why do you call this the Institute for Informatic Problems? Why not Informatic Solutions? And he said, because this is Russia.
Can I back up just 1 second?
Sure.
Who introduced you to Golden? How did you get it?
Our translator from the Esalen Institute.
Oh, okay. So she knew him already from programs they were doing with him.
Yes.
Okay, because I had seen this overlap with his name.
Right.
So,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
He was working with Michael Murphy and Jim Hickman at the Esalen Institute.
Great.
But he had never been to the United States before we invited him over here. But anyway, So it was Anya who introduced us to Joseph. And anyway, Naumov then sent me to Oleg Smirnov at the Institute for Automated Systems, the NIPAS, which became my partner.
Okay.
So I met those guys because of meeting Rauschenbach, in the hospital.
Right. And these guys met with you and you just walked in cold? They didn't know you? Right. Do you think they had some file, some briefing, some investigation?
The fact that Rauschenbach recommended me.
Yeah.
He was a major Soviet scientist at that time.
Yeah.
That's all I needed was his recommendation.
Okay. So this is the Russian style of doing through connections and recommendations and network. That
it's all networking, and because Joseph also introduced me to academician Yevgeny Velikhov, who was, he was Gorbachev's science advisor, vice president of the Academy Institute for Atomic Physics. He became my mentor, and loved what I was doing with doing the computer connections, and gave me all the permissions I ever needed for microwave frequencies. Anytime I had a problem. I had a guy who's the head of the Ministry of Communications who wanted me to give him a bribe.
Yeah.
To sign my international license. So I called Yevgeny and I said, your Ministry of Communications wants a bribe.
Yeah.
He said, well, what's the guy's phone number? I gave Yevgeny his phone number, and Yevgeny called me back 3 minutes later. Your contract's been signed, it's been faxed to your office. I said, what did you do? He says, I threatened to fire him.
Yeah.
It was so I mean, Velikhov was my savior at the highest level, anything I needed to happen.
Right. And why do you think he did that? What was Velikhov? It was this sort of early days and they wanted to build relations with the US, or what was going on with that?
He understood that that the Soviet Union was so stuck in its economy that it couldn't survive without international investment and technology from the West. And he knew he couldn't get investors to come into the Soviet Union if they couldn't communicate. It took, a week or two to make a phone call. Telex was bulky and it barely worked. Here I was saying, I want to bring electronic mail and open up the system. At that time, we weren't even talking about an improved telephone system. That was a couple of years later, after I met George Soros. And how I met Soros is also, in terms of networking, would you be interested to know?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, there was a little child pianist named Polina Satinskaya. She's a child prodigy, 6 years old. We met her through Joseph.
Okay.
And her father was her teacher, was also molesting her. So we were trying to get her out of the country. And I approached Gordon Getty in San Francisco, and he said he would pay for her transportation to the San Francisco to have her study at the conservatory. But that didn't work out. But at the same time, I was trying to help Polina. Soros's foundation manager in Moscow, Gennady, what was his name? It'll come to me. He was also trying to help Polina. So Diane and I met, this guy, because we were all trying to save this little girl. And this guy said, I work for a billionaire. Do you need money? I said, sure. He said, well, his name is George Soros. Here's his phone number. Tell him I sent you. So I called Soros, and he said, come on over. So I went to see him.
Now, where did you go see him?
I saw him in New York City. I was flying back and forth at his office on West 57th. And he said, you wanting to connect by computer? I said, yeah. He said, well, how much money do you need? I said, well, I don't know. I don't have a corporation and I don't have a business plan yet. He says, those are details. How much money do you need for starts? Like you need maybe plane fare, lawyers, some equipment. I said, okay, $500,000. He says, okay, here's my deal. I'll give you $250,000 if you find somebody to match me in 24 hours. Goodbye. So I left his office.
Yeah.
And thinking, I came from the nonprofit world and government world. So that seemed to me like $50 billion.
Right. Yeah.
So I had a clue about a guy in New York, another rich guy named Alan Slivka. So I called him and I went over to see him in his office on Madison Avenue. And I told him the story.
Yeah.
He said, okay, I'll consider it, but I need about a month to decide. I said, no, I'll give you 10 minutes or I'm going to lose $250,000.
Right.
And he took his eyeglasses off and bit them. I remember that. He said, okay, I'm in. So I called George back and I found the other matching funds. And he said, what took so long? The next day, these two guys wired $500,000 from my personal checking account at Wells Fargo. Nothing was signed. And George said, go to work.
Wow. And they sent it to your personal account, and they didn't invest in a company. They didn't get shares.
They just gave me $500,000.
Yeah. Yeah. And because they believed in the mission that you were trying to do.
George Soros, he's a guy that makes decisions with his gut. If it's comfortable, he goes with it. If he's got tension in his gut, he says no. He liked me. Yeah. He believed if anybody could do what I said I was going to do, that I had a chance. He just felt that about me. We really clicked.
Yeah. So what did you tell him you were going to do?
I wanted to introduce first scientists and then business people and educators and physicians and writers and artists by electronic mail, and to open up the system for two-way communication.
Yeah.
There were only 33 international telephone trunk lines between 300 million Soviets and the outside world.
I didn't even think there were that many, honestly.
There were 33. And 50,000 thermonuclear weapons aimed at each other's population centers. Right. It seemed to us to be an insane case of danger.
Yeah.
My motive was not to make money. It was to try to open up two-way communication between the peoples of both countries.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and oddly enough, my timing was so perfect. Everything I tried to do to open up the system, I got the green light. And Velikhov, then when I met him, he just cleared the way for me. Anything I needed. When I needed that satellite link with Intelsat, he just said, okay, you got it. I mean, it was just a phone call.
And he got you that link with Intelsat.
No, I got the link, and I got it for free.
For free.
Yeah, because Reagan had a summit in 1989 with Gorbachev in Moscow, and IDB Communications from Culver City, California, had the rights to do the television feed, so they flew over satellite dishes and all this stuff. And the president of IDB said, I'd like to do business here. And I said, well, I can help you. He said, well, I've got a T1 circuit with Intelsat for a few years. I'll let you use it for free. All I need from you is advice. I said, it's a deal. So I got free service, and he never asked me a single question after that day.
Really?
Yeah. So I got a free circuit on Intelsat.
Wow. So you began with the email, and when did the email start working?
Oh, that started working in 1980. Let's see, my first trip was 84. It was 85.
85. Yeah.
And then we were shut down by the Defense Department. That's when I hired this pit bull attorney from San Francisco. It wasn't Brian. It was a mad dog attorney.
Yeah.
We went back to the Commerce Department demanding that they tell us what laws we were breaking, and they couldn't find any laws, so they let us come back on.
Uh-huh.
And then we got into database access as well, and we started to just, we went first to American business people and European business people. Every one of them wanted a link.
Right.
And it was a couple of years later when I met Soros. He said, let's build a telephone company also. And I said, I don't know anything about the telephone business. He said, well, just find some people who can help you.
Yeah.
So again, Velikhov said, it's a great idea. Our phone system sucks.
Right.
So I built Sovintel, which was the first digital international phone system in Moscow.
Yeah. And you went out and you hired American experts and
yeah, right. And I did the same thing even with email, because the phone systems, as you know, was so terrible in Russia.
Yeah.
That I needed special error correcting modems. So I flew over a guy from US Robotics out of the Chicago office, and he tested all the phone lines. And he said, well, where is the worst phone line in Moscow? I said, it happens to be at the dacha of Yevgeny Velikhov. He said, let's go. So we went to Velikhov's dacha, and it was a terrible phone line. And this guy did some stuff with the modem and got it to work over the worst phone line. This error correcting system of resending the signals.
Right.
And so then we used those modems with all of our customers, and the business was growing really fast because everybody wanted the email link.
Right.
Everybody.
Right. Wow. And so there was this pent up demand for the communication that you
Absolutely. And then more and more, you know, as Western business people realized they could actually work out of Moscow, their investments increased for all kinds of business.
Yeah.
And, you know, and it's what the Russians wanted, what they needed.
Right. Right. So, and your first customers were what, big companies like GE or?
It was Control Data Corporation was one of the first customers. Another one was the Library of Congress, and I connected them to the Supreme Soviet. And another one was Time Magazine, and what they wanted was access to their database in New York City, so their reporters in Moscow, in writing stories, could have immediate access to do research.
Right.
And, you know, the word spread, and we could barely keep up with the demand.
Right.
And we were the only people doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this was still the Soviet Union, and you were a joint venture at that point, correct?
No, the joint venture actually started in 1989.
Okay. So what were you at that time? What kind of an entity were you?
I was a little nonprofit called San Francisco Moscow Teleport.
Yeah.
It was out of San Francisco.
Okay.
And it was funded by two generous philanthropists in the Bay Area. It was like, oh, by the way, when we signed the joint venture in '89 with Venipas, I had one more day to put $250,000 cash into the joint venture, and Soros had not wired the money yet. And they were going to cancel the JV. So I called him and I said, "Where's the $250,000 that you promised?" He said, "Oh, it's been earning interest. I'll wire it today." And the money came into Venezia Canal Bank, the only Soviet bank. So I went there and I said, "Okay, here's proof from Metellix that the money has been wired to your bank." And they said, "Okay, it's probably here, but we don't know where it is." I said, "But it's proof that you got it." He said, "Yeah, I can see that we have it, but I said, "I need $50,000 US right now." He said, "Okay, I'll give you $50,000. I said, "If you're not doing it from my wire, where are you getting the money from?" "I'll take it from somebody else's account." And he gave me $50,000.
Wow. Wow.
You know, I could write 500 volumes of my experience in Russia and nobody would believe it.
Right. Yeah.
Because almost everything that happened was bizarre.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It was all seat of the pants. So when you were operating, I don't want to beat this point to death, but when you were operating doing the email, and did you have an office in Moscow? I mean, were you in some government agency? Where were your physical presence?
I was physically working out of the Venipas building. They gave me a desk.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
It was a few blocks from Red Square.
Right. And so when people were your customers and they paid you, they paid into an account in San Francisco. There was no business activity in
the dollars were paid to us in California.
Yeah.
And the rubles from the Russian people were paid in rubles to Venipas, who was our informal partner.
I see. So it was an informal arrangement until it became
really informal, because had we asked permission to do a business together, we would have been denied.
Yeah.
So we called it an experiment, because in principle, experiments were very loosey-goosey. Nobody really cared if it was an experiment.
Right. Right. Okay. Okay. But then once after the joint venture law was passed, you were able to form a joint venture.
Yeah, it was legal business. That's correct. And we were 50-50 partners.
Yeah.
And it grew very quickly. And the same was true with the Sovan Teleport. I signed that telephone contract in 1990 with the Main Trunk Line Control Center of the Ministry of Communications. And that was 50-50 joint venture. And then went to Leningrad that year and formed another telephone joint venture called Baltic Communications Limited. My partner was GT SpaceNet, GT SpaceNet was Soventel. My partner was a British company. I forget the name of the company now, but anyway,
BT.
It was Mercury Communications. It was
okay. Yeah.
And so and they were also a 50-50. joint venture with me. We were still, and then SFMT became absorbed into Global Telesystems Group. That company then grew into all kinds of telecom activities throughout Europe.
Yeah.
And it eventually went bankrupt.
Huh.
But the Wall Street geniuses said, we don't like your Russia company. It might take down the GTS value. So we formed a special new company called Golden Telecom, which was our Russia properties.
Right.
It was email and phones and everything. And we separated it from GTS. The GTS went bankrupt. Golden Telecom was eventually sold for $4 billion to Vimpelcom. I mean, you can't, how do you,
Yeah.
you can dream this stuff up. It's so bizarre.
Right. But when you had Russian partners throughout all this or not?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And did they play an active part in the company? Are they passive, or what role did they play?
They didn't know what they were doing. Like, for example, when we wanted to sign up all the major hotels as telephone customers,
right?
I would tell the hotel managers, here's the deal. We don't want any money from you. We're going to spend millions of dollars on satellite equipment, on telephones, digital phones. And they said, well, something is not right here. Why would you bring all this millions of dollars of stuff and not ask us for anything? I said, what I'm asking for is permission to make money as a 50-50 partner with you on all telephone calls.
Right.
We just make the investment in the equipment and the satellite fees. They just had the hardest time understanding that.
Yeah.
There was just no sense of business.
Right. And these
they all went for it.
Yeah. And these were all the Russian hotels in tourist hotels and so on.
The major hotels, right? The national, right? Sure.
Yeah. So how did you made this transition from being an activist to being a manager? Did you have professional managers that you brought over to form the company?
Yeah. I brought all kinds of people over. I brought technical people. I brought financial people.
Yeah.
And money wasn't the problem. When it came to GTS, when we first formed Global Telesystems Group, Soros put in a few $1 million of additional cash.
I see. And
because that business was just growing so big. In fact, before it fell into bankruptcy, its market cap reached $6 billion.
Wow.
And then it went from 6 billion to zero.
Yeah. And why? What caused that to happen?
What happened was we had a lot of Wall Street people on the board who didn't know anything about the technology.
Uh-huh.
And at that time, international phone service was so lucrative that it stimulated a lot of competition. New companies went into business. The technology was becoming more efficient, therefore becoming less expensive to operate. And we were expanding as a corporation mostly by selling debt. And then we didn't have the revenue that we expected in order to repay the debt.
I see.
That happened to quite a few telecom companies.
Right.
So we were being mismanaged by these Wall Street guys that didn't know anything.
Yeah. Huh. So they were setting your kind of fiscal policy and expansion.
Yeah, but they were not even interested in looking at the technology. In fact, in one board meeting, I said, eventually, we're going to have voice over the internet. And they just laughed at me. They just thought I was nuts.
Yeah. But that was later. But when you went in Global Telesystems, did you bring the Russians along with you? Were they part of that?
No.
Okay. So Sovintel and Baltic Communications, you had Russian
That's right. We were co-owners.
Co-owners. Okay. And so you sold those into Global Telesystems, or how did that transition work?
We let's see. I don't really remember the details how that happened. I've got to think about that. We transferred those joint ventures into Golden Telecom.
Into Golden Telecom. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And that became that was an all Russian run company that was separated from GTS.
Okay. And who managed that one? Golden Telecom. People you brought in?
Soros brought a few people in. We had a guy named Jerry Thames who became the CEO. No, Golden Telecom? No, sorry about that. It was GTS. Golden Telecom. I don't remember because I left Russia in '91 and I had a passive role, you know.
Okay.
I stayed with GTS and I don't really remember who was running the company at that point.
Okay. Okay.
You know, I called Soros one day in 1991 and I said, you know, I didn't grow up to spend the rest of my life living in Russia building telephone companies. I want to go back to America. I have a new idea for a software company. And he says, you mean you want to finally leave Russia? I said, yeah, because we were living there for like 9 years, mostly.
Mostly.
And he said, you finally want to leave after 9 years? Do you still have your sanity after 9 years? I'll never forget that conversation.
Yeah.
George is a remarkably funny guy. We just really liked each other.
Yeah. That I'm sure that makes a huge difference in what you were able to do together, right? That you had a personal bond. Yeah. And
I could call him at any time for any reason, no problem.
Yeah. And those 9 years that you lived there, what did you have, an apartment in Moscow?
We had an apartment in Moscow, right next to very near the Arbat, and then in St. Petersburg. It was Leningrad back then.
Yeah.
An apartment in a former KGB party house on a place called Stone Island, where we had a great kitchen staff, and it was just a beautiful facility.
Yeah.
And we paid rubles for rent, so we paid nothing basically.
Right.
And we just, you know, just made everything work. It was so simple. And Brian, here's one story about Brian. He may not have told you, but I needed him back in Leningrad. He was I think in Bulgaria. Or no, he was in Yerevan, and he needed to get back to Leningrad quickly because I really needed him for a contract. But the only plane he could take was flying to Moscow.
Uh-huh.
He got on the plane in Yerevan, and he mentioned to a guy sitting next to him that he was really upset because he needed to get to Leningrad. And the guy says, "Give me $100." He says, "Why?" He says, "Give me $100 bill." And the guy took his money and went into the cockpit and was talking to the captain. And as they took off, the pilot said, "We've made a change of plans. We actually have to fly to Leningrad first." He said to Brian, "You hijacked the plane?" He says, "I didn't look at it in those terms, but I think that's what happened."
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
And that was, again, that's just a normal little thing.
Right.
I mean, it's, you know, and when Gorbachev was arrested during that coup attempt, that 3-day coup or 4-day coup, I was in Kazan signing a joint venture.
Uh-huh.
And they announced the coup on the overnight train, August 31st. I'll never forget that, 91. As we were coming into Kazan, they said, "Comrade Gorbachev is ill." This is an announcement on the train. I had never heard an announcement. I didn't even know they had a PA system on the train.
Right.
They said, "But not to worry." This is the announcement, because tractor production is expected to increase today.
Wow.
Got that one?
Yeah.
So I knew we were in deep shit.
Yeah.
I got there, we signed the contract, and then it was for a cellular system. And when I got back to the States, I was describing to the board people and Goldman Sachs guys about this contract. He said, "How did you sign a contract in the middle of a coup?" I said, "Because in Russia, they separated revolution from economics."
Yeah.
They said, "What?" It's the truth. We signed the goddamn joint venture in the middle of a coup.
Yeah.
And I couldn't even call Moscow because the coup leaders cut the telephone lines.
Right.
I finally got a call back to Diane, who was in San Francisco, via Istanbul.
Wow.
And I said, "Hey, we signed a joint venture." She said, "Don't you know what's going on?" I said, "Yeah, we're watching it. I've got my BBC, portable radio. I know, but we signed the JV."
Yeah.
So she was real excited. And I made plans because if the coup leaders had succeeded, people like me would have been very unpopular because they were completely opposed to Western communication. Right. And I said, if I have to maybe escape, I'll escape via Turkey disguised as a Russian Orthodox priest. I'd already been making my plans.
You had plans to do that if necessary.
Yes, I had to.
Yeah.
Because we didn't know which way this little coup thing was going to end up.
Right. Wow. So before that coup happened,
by the way, there was no sign that was going to happen. The night before we got on the train, it was peaceful Sunday night in Moscow. Lovers walking on the streets. It was totally calm, and there was no clue.
Right. And you had no sense of it from people that you were talking to or anything. I mean,
nobody had a clue. Gorbachev didn't have a clue, for God's sakes.
Right.
The people who turned on him were the people that he appointed.
Yeah. So as far as you were concerned, while you were up until that moment, you would be dealing with the Soviet Union ad infinitum into the future. You were going to be building for some reform of the Soviet Union, though.
We knew that communication was a necessary ingredient in stabilizing relations between East and West. We just in our gut we knew. The opposite would have been who knows what kind of miscalculation or disaster would have occurred.
Right.
And oddly enough, looking at what's going on today,
we
thought we solved the Cold War problem and the nuclear disaster problems, 30 years ago. And today, I think we're facing more danger than we faced back then.
Yeah, I mean, this is another conversation, but I think we're in worse shape in terms of communication than when it was simply a technical problem. It's a more deeper chasm that we have in communication right now, unfortunately. And to do what you did then, I mean, something similar would have faced so much social opprobrium and distaste, of dealing with Russians. I mean, you had, at least within the community you lived in, support for this idea that you were not only doing a business, but building communications. Am I correct about that?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah.
And all of our relationships with our Russian partners were more like family than business relationships. We became very close friends.
Yeah.
And oddly enough, the reason we ended up in first place, all of our competitors like British Telecom or US West all tried to do, like Gary Hart, for example, was a representative for US West after he lost his thing on the monkey business boat.
Right.
And I was having drinks with him at the National Hotel one night, and he says, how did you get so far in this country? I said, well, first of all, every time your company, US West, sends people over to negotiate, they send different people. You don't have people who form relationships.
Yeah.
And that was true with almost every Western company. Yeah. They didn't understand. They needed to send the same people. They needed to live there. They needed to become trustworthy.
Yeah.
They need to become known quantities. And so he was taking notes, about, well, we need to send the same people. But the fact is, we never made promises we couldn't keep.
Yeah.
We made a point of being trusted. And it made all the difference.
Yeah. Did you ever learn Russian or some bit of Russian?
No, I speak like Tarzan Russian, like "Я хочу контракт," me want contract.
Right. Yeah.
And they would laugh because all of our business partners spoke English.
Okay.
Many of them were from scientific backgrounds, and English was the second language.
I see. Okay. Yeah. But
And Brian Zimbler, because he came back, he went traveling back and forth, but because he was bilingual, would be very helpful during negotiations. And we did hire translators when Brian was not around, but language was never a problem. And those contracts were golden. There was never any expectation that they would ever be broken by either side. They were completely firm.
Yeah.
Based on trust.
Yeah. 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 Very, very, and your competitors, came and went. I mean, you really established something.
Yeah. Let me tell you something else. When Anatoly Sobchak was the late Sobchak was the mayor of Leningrad.
Right.
He decided to hold a meeting of all the so-called competitors because people were approaching him to do all kinds of telecom projects. And he said, I want to find out which ones are real. So he invited representatives of maybe a dozen or more Western technology companies who were all telecom.
Right.
But before that meeting, I went out with my bilingual translator, Veronica Frantella, and I took photographs of our site in Leningrad. We had an actual teleport with microwave dishes, and we had a gigantic trailer at the bottom of the building which had backup battery generators, and we had it was a real teleport. And then I went around and I took photographs of empty lots where all the competitors said they were building. They said we're in process of building.
Right.
And I had 8 by 10 photographs of these dozen empty lots.
Yeah.
When it came my turn, subject said, and who are you? And I explained, I showed photographs of our teleport. Ulica Gertsina. And I said, and here are the photographs of my competitors' projects. And I showed them one by one. And he said, meeting canceled. And then he asked me, why do you think that your competitors are just lying? I said, because they don't have respect for your people.
Yeah.
They think they can just, play games.
Yeah. 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 Wow.
And they were Ital Cable. They were big corporations that were doing that.
Yeah.
They hadn't.
So were they playing games, or were they premature? Was it that you got there first, or
they were kind of jockeying with each other, trying to see who can maybe land some kind of a contract,
right?
And so they were making up stories to look good.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what they would call marketing, right? So,
yeah. I mean, I felt because I felt such compassion for my Russian, compatriots. I felt I felt that they should be ashamed of themselves for what they were doing. I felt angry at them for misbehaving so badly.
Yeah.
For example, they promised the guy from the Astoria Hotel, they wanted to charge him $800,000 for a 3-meter dish, which was an inflated price times 1,000.
Yeah.
Because the hotel managers didn't know anything about the technology. They were just trying to gouge.
Yeah. And it sounds like from what you're saying, it was a combination of your sensibilities or your sensitivities, your relationships, and the fact that you had access to capital to actually implement these plans.
Money was never a problem. Soros would always write a check.
Yeah.
In the early days.
Yeah.
And then I really began to learn the rules of how to operate in the Soviet bureaucracy. And once I learned that there were no rules, which was the rule, I made up my own rules and did my thing, and nobody ever stopped me.
Yeah.
For example, we needed to dig a trench in front of the Parliament building in Leningrad.
Yeah.
And I couldn't get permission to do it. So I rented jackhammers, a bunch of guys in uniforms. We got sawhorses with, road cones, and we sealed off the street in front of and we dug up a trench, and and I'm walking around with a clipboard, because when you walk around with a clipboard, you obviously are an important person.
Absolutely, yeah.
And nothing on a clipboard, right?
Yeah.
The local police never asked what we were doing. We laid fiber, we covered the trench back over, and after we finished, I wrote a formal request to do that. Thinking that maybe in 5 years, some clerk might find it.
Yeah.
I just did what I needed to do. And I did that for years. I was just making up my own rules.
Right. And this was in the late Soviet period. This was at 89, 90, somewhere.
No, this was 88 to 90, yeah.
Yeah.
And, it's like, and then a bank opened in Leningrad for foreign currency. So a Russian-owned bank. So I went there and I said, now how do I make a deposit of dollars? And the girl showed me how to do that. And I said, how can I make a withdrawal? Oh, you can't. You can only make deposits. Maybe in a year you can make withdrawals. I said, how many customers do you have? She said, well, we don't have any customers. Can you imagine why? It was like, oh my God.
Yeah, yeah. But do you think, what impact do you think your enterprise had on teaching Russians about international business and telecom business? Did you have an impact?
I think so, because our Russian counterparts learned quickly about the technology.
Yeah.
They were learning about marketing, and they were learning about business structure, about making business plans. I mean, under the Soviet system, they had, for example, in Moscow, a surplus of skis and a shortage of windshield wiper blades, because the Central Committee never asked the market what they needed. They just said, this is what you should have.
Yeah.
They just proclaimed. There was no feedback at all.
Yeah.
People would ask me when I would come back to the States, what's it like in Russia? I said, imagine the entire U.S. economy being run by the U.S. Postal Service. That's the Soviet Union. Everyone was a civil servant, from cosmonauts to engineers to clowns in the circus.
All true.
They were civil servants.
Right. But
so, and I made up a new definition of Murphy's Law when I was living there.
Okay.
In Russia, Murphy's Law is nothing is possible, but occasionally something works.
Yeah. That fits. That fits.
And my Russian colleagues, they agreed that's really accurate.
Yeah, that is accurate. And were you doing market studies at that time? I mean, in terms of levels of demand or whatever, you just built it, it filled up.
We couldn't produce equipment fast enough to put in offices and business centers. The word got out, and we had no competition for years.
Yeah. And when do you think competition started to appear for you?
In the early 90s. It's when GTS pulled out of Russia. Golden Telecom was expanding rapidly, but it stimulated a lot of competition.
Yeah.
Because the demand was so great.
Right. So, and do you know, did any of your former employees go and start businesses in telecom that you know of?
Some of them actually worked for telecom companies. My first Russian employee, who was 25 at the time, Andrei Kolesnikov, he I guess about 20 years ago, became the director of domain names for the Russian internet. And now he is the director of the Internet of Things in Russia.
Okay.
And he's doing really well. I can also tell you that when we formed my software company back in the 90s, and we were giving away some founder stock to people who really were helpful, I gave some substantial quantities of founder stock to two of my former Russian employees who were so helpful to me. In the early days, I could never have done what I did without them, because they did stuff for me above and beyond the call of duty. I gave them this founder stock, which turned out to be, when we went public, worth about $250,000 US each for these guys. And I felt so just happy to do that, because and that money stayed in the United States at Merrill Lynch, and they could access it through bank cards, whatever.
Right. They must have been ecstatic with that. Yeah.
And they did good things with it, but we employed so many people. I don't know what happened to most of them. I mean, at one point, GTS, I know, employed several tens of thousands of people.
Wow.
Worldwide.
Wow.
and even Golden Telecom at some point employed several thousand people.
Yeah.
And I don't know how they spun off or what they did,
Sure.
but they were all so grateful for not only the opportunity to work in those businesses, but they were happy to see their customers were so happy with what they were doing for them. I mean,
Right.
it was such a period of optimism, Dan. And it was like we felt in the 60s when things were opening up, you know, people were wearing bell-bottom, trousers.
Yeah.
And the Russians were traveling for the first time. And, there was a sense of openness and joy and just excitement.
Yeah.
Contagious.
Yeah.
And telecom played a huge part in that.
Yeah. And so if you can put yourself back in that time, after the fall of the Soviet Union is dissolved, Russia is getting on its feet. How did you expect things would develop in Russia? Did it turn out like you thought?
I thought it would be chaotic, but I didn't think it would be as bad as it turned out to be. In fact, right after interesting, you mentioned the fall of the Soviet Union, we had just signed the Baltic Communications JV, and then I got the minister, because of Velikov, to give me the license. And I went to the International Telecommunications Union, Geneva, to get permission to exercise the license to begin commercial activity. Mm-hmm. And they said to me, we can't do that because to be a signatory to the International Telecommunications Union, you have to be a legitimate country. The Soviet Union no longer exists, and Russia has not yet been identified as a country. I said, come on, this is Russia. There's 300 million people. They have birds and doorknobs. It's a country.
Yeah.
And they said, well, we'll make an exception. We'll let Cable and Wireless sign for the Russian counterpart. They'll sign both sides of the Connect agreement to the satellite.
Right.
But they actually said Russia doesn't exist. I
went
berserk.
Yeah. That was.
But to answer your question, no one could have foreseen. We knew that it would be chaotic. Suddenly, salaries were disappearing from major Soviet research institutes. People were going to work even though they weren't being paid. Yeah. They went out of habit because they had nothing else to do, figuring the money would eventually, come. So we saw the signs of disintegration. But it was around that time that we moved back to California.
I see.
But I could never have foreseen today what's going on. It's just shameful.
Yeah.
Given the educated, talented people in Russia, can you imagine if they were encouraged to do role model stuff in terms of green energy and if you could give permission and incentives to really bright Russians to make a safer world?
Yeah.
Better the world would be today, but instead you've got this crook and his cronies.
Yeah. No, true. Did you have an opinion about Yeltsin in those days? Did you have hopes for him, or did you have any?
It was well known that he was a super alcoholic.
Yeah.
When he picked Putin, the KGB guy, we saw that as a sign that something's not right here.
Yeah.
And although we didn't expect dramatic changes, none of us, including our Russian friends, could have predicted where we are today.
Yeah.
Especially in terms of the internet, because I don't know how closely you're following the restrictions that are going on, but it's getting worse and worse. And face recognition in Moscow is really taking off through telecom in order to, track people. Yeah. And so the surveillance society is kind of beginning to mirror what's going on in China.
Yeah. Probably with Chinese technology too, I would assume. Yeah.
So, I don't know. I just know that I feel we're in touch all the time by email and by phone, and also with FaceTime, especially, which I use a lot with our Russian friends, and they're just so upset about what's going on in Moscow and Leningrad right now.
Yeah.
It's really furious.
Yeah. So it really, and you think that Yeltsin's appointment of Putin was like a turning point in this whole process?
It had to have been because, I mean, he was drunk and Putin was ambitious.
Yeah.
He had his nefarious connections. And, you could see no good coming out of that.
Yeah.
I mean, when Yeltsin came to the United States, it was the Esalen people who brought him over. And, he was pissing on the street in Washington, D.C., against trees.
Yeah.
It was, he was completely like just gonzo drunk.
Yeah. I've heard some of those stories. Yeah. I think one story I heard was that he was supposed to meet Reagan and he was too drunk and they put him back in the car and called the meeting off. But
Jim Garrison from Esalen was the guy that was his tour guide around here. Jim lives here in Mill Valley, and he came a couple of years ago here and he gave us a blow-by-blow description of that visit.
Yeah.
It was just like horrifying.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So, I don't know. I mean, Russia has never had an easy time. But the other thing about Russian history, as you know, is throughout hundreds of years, they've changed leadership on a dime.
Yeah.
The Tsar and his wife and kids never expected to be murdered one day.
No, that's true.
Who expected any of this to happen?
Yeah. 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 So, I mean, you've kept connections with people just socially.
Right.
Yeah. No business after you moved back to the States in '91.
No.
Yeah. So there was other managers of Golden Telecom. I mean, somebody was running it after you left. Is that right? I mean,
yeah, I don't know who they were. There was a guy from Holland, I think. They brought a foreigner in to run it because he had great management skills, but it was a Russian-owned company.
Okay. And did you still have shares in Golden Telecom?
No.
Or you got bought out at the when the joint ventures were absorbed by Golden Telecom?
Yeah, my stock was in GTS, and although we were able to sell some stock, when it finally fell precipitously, Wall Street put a freeze on the sale of stock. And we basically, in one day, lost millions of dollars. And we're basically down to nothing. But around that time, I was raising money for my software company. And we managed to be bought by a company for 60. How much was it? For about $150 million. So I went from millions of dollars to zero.
Right.
And then within a period of 2 months, went back up again.
Wow.
And in fact, the day that we lost all the money, I went to the beach with Diane and I started doing a Zorba the Greek dance along the Pacific coast in San Francisco. And she said, "Why are you dancing?" I said, "Because the universe is larger than a margin call." And I told this to my finance advisor at Merrill Lynch, Tom Raytano, who's been just a wonderful guy over the years. And he said, "I've never known anybody who went from nothing to a lot to nothing to a lot, like a yo-yo, like you did."
Yeah.
You do a Zorba the dance one, because the guy called me and said, you no longer have any assets.
What a call. Yeah.
I'll never forget that call. I was on Crissy Field in San Francisco, and Tom called me and said, "I have very bad news for you." And then a few months later, Interwoven, bought us, and then they went bankrupt.
Whoa.
They were a $2 billion market cap company, and they folded after they bought our company. But their assets were sent to British Telecom, and British Telecom was then sent their assets to Hewlett Packard. And so Hewlett Packard owned some of the, even some of the software ideas that I had in my software. I mean, I don't know. I mean, if you draw a diagram of all this, it would be like hard to follow it.
Right. Well, I did a little diagram for myself about Sobam Teleport, Sobantel, GTS. So just so that I would have an orientation, but yours is a much bigger diagram of the relationships of these companies.
And you know, when I brought my first video telephone, the one that got lost in Istanbul and finally came to me, I tried to get it through Soviet customs, and the woman says, "Schatz, what is this?" And I said, "Video telephone." So she looks in her book of all possible objects in the universe.
Right.
She says, "It does not exist." She's pointing at this object, and she said, "It does not exist.
This does not exist."
It got taken away and put in storage somewhere, and I called Zelikoff, and he got the thing out for me.
Wow.
And we, you know, like we had to bring alligator clips with us all the time because they couldn't find any alligator clips in the entire Soviet Union.
Yeah.
They had no Radio Shacks there, any kind of stores. In fact, when we were painting the Baltic Communication logo, which Diane, my wife, did on the inside of the dish, so you can see BCL, we couldn't find any blue paint because there was not a single paint shop in the entire Soviet Union, like a retail paint store.
Yeah.
So we went with a Russian friend to a marina, and we found some guy painting his boat blue.
Right.
And I gave the guy $10 and I said, "Can I have a pint of this, you know, paint?" Which had some strange objects floating in it. But so he gave us this paint, and she used that paint to paint the logo on the dish.
Wow.
And the dish, by the way, was on a building in Leningrad by a canal. By the palace where Rasputin was killed. And we could see the window where his half-dead body was pulled out when he finally drowned in that canal. And that was where our teleport was, where BCO was.
Fantastic.
You know, so we have, so many remembrances that were so like bizarre. Like once I was with Joseph Golden, and we did a video teleconference from Venipos with Armand Hammer and Robert Gale, the doctor who was the bone marrow immunologist who was helping with the Chernobyl victims.
Okay.
So we did this video telephone link. And after that link, I'm walking in Red Square with Joseph, and he points to Lenin's mausoleum. He says, "I can't believe we were just talking to a guy that used to have breakfast with that guy."
Yeah, true.
And so, you know, I don't know if you know this, but Armand Hammer's first business deal after the Bolshevik Revolution was to sell pencils because literacy became the big push of Lenin. And they didn't have pencils. And I said, "Great, I'm going to tell people I'm selling electronic pencils."
Yeah.
I thought that was kind of a cool marketing idea.
Absolutely. Wow. And was Armand Hammer was the Hammer Center, the Mejdunarодnaya Center, built at that point? It was built.
Yeah, it was built there.
Yeah.
When we first went there, it was built.
Okay. Did you have a dish there?
We did not.
No. Okay.
And I remember they had a very large mechanical rooster in the lobby. They would chime every hour and wake up everybody.
Still there.
Everybody. It was so obnoxious.
Yes, it's still there. I've seen it. Actually, I think they're doing a major refurbishment of that hotel now, but because it's so old. So, and where? I mean, where'd you get groceries? How did you eat while you were there? Did you have a cook, or how did that work?
We went to restaurants a lot.
Yeah.
But also we learned that a lot of restaurants closed for lunch to feed their workers.
That
was quite common, actually. And once I was at a restaurant and I wanted chicken, and they said, "Chicken deficit. We don't have chicken."
Yeah.
And I'd walk into the kitchen and I'd find chicken. There's a restaurant. And I said, "I want that chicken." They said, "Okay." And they give me a chicken.
Yeah.
I mean, at that point, I was fearless.
Yeah. How old were you then?
Well, let's see. I was late 40s, early 50s. It was the period that when we were living there.
Yeah. Okay.
And then Russian grocery stores were impossible at that time. I mean, you stand in line to find something.
Right.
You stand in another line to write out a piece of paper, then another line to pay.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I figured Russians would never go into revolution. They were too busy standing in line.
Lines. Yeah. Yeah.
And then these foreign grocery stores came into Moscow and Leningrad.
Yeah.
And you could buy anything from Heinz ketchup to, I mean, it was just miraculous. That was just starting in the mid to late 80s.
Right. What's Stockman's?
Stockman's came from Finland.
Yeah.
I remember when we were living in Leningrad, there was not a Stockman's yet, but the American consulate was getting weekly deliveries of groceries. And I said, I'll make you guys a deal. I said to the consul general, if you let me get groceries through the consulate, I'll make you first priority to get a satellite dish back to Washington, D.C. Because I had the ability to do that.
Right.
He said, deal. So we got groceries delivered every week, and he got a satellite within a week.
Wow.
A satellite connection.
Wow. Did you imported the satellite equipment?
Yeah, and we had problems with COCOM.
Yeah.
Because a lot of it was in violation of some antiquated restrictions on transfer of technology.
Yeah.
And, the Americans, so I would import that from Belgium. I wouldn't import it from the United States because the Belgians didn't care.
Okay. Okay.
And, and I was arguing with the Commerce Department about technology all the time. I said, I want to bring a Cray computer into Moscow. They said, you can't do that. I said, no, I'm not bringing the physical computer. I'll leave that in Chicago. I want to have a satellite connection to the computer in Chicago and have a monitor and a ability to actually access the machine. But the machine will stay here.
Right.
In America, they said, well, we don't have any regulations for that. Nobody's ever, talked about transferring technology without transferring the machine. They had no even way to think about doing anything like that.
Right.
And I did learn. I think I sent you the thing about the FBI. I mean, when I was a New York Times article, I think I sent you this thing.
I think you did. Yeah.
When they called me to the Pentagon after they made the front page of the satellite connection, and they didn't really understand anything about Russian telecom technology. They thought they understood. They didn't know anything about what packet switching protocols we're using. They thought they did. And I was teaching them there in the Pentagon how it worked.
Right.
I never held back with anybody.
Yeah. And why were they so poorly informed? I mean, that's weird. It wasn't important. They didn't consider that.
They didn't have adequate resources. Spies.
Yeah. Okay.
They just didn't. They didn't know what the hell they were talking about.
Right. Well, they probably weren't too happy about you doing this, obviously.
Well, the FBI agents in San Francisco every time I would return, I would get a call from Agent Barry Hatfield from the FBI. And like the following morning after I would arrive, he'd call me.
Yeah.
Hey, Barry, how did you know I just got back? And he would laugh and we would have lunch together. And both he and a guy named Rick Smith, who was the chief Soviet guy for the FBI here, loved what we were doing. They're all college graduates. They're just smart guys.
Yeah.
But the bureaucrats back in Washington that don't really deal with the real world.
Yeah.
They were just totally misinformed. We never had problems with the FBI. They would ask, who did you meet with on this trip? I would tell them everything.
Yeah.
I never held back. Then they did me a favor. I needed maps. You probably don't know about this. I needed accurate maps of Moscow. Now, what you may not know is what Russians published, they would move train stations and rivers. They were not where they were supposed to be.
Right. Yeah.
And they didn't have any scale on any of their maps. So I said to Hatfield one day, do you guys have an accurate map of Moscow? He says, I have better than that. And he brought over to scale U2 photographs of Moscow. which I still have actually in my home here as souvenirs.
Wow.
I brought those back to our Russian partners because we were trying to where to put like cell sites and next to wherever. And I made copies of this U2 photograph, which they just loved because for the first time they could actually see a map of Moscow that was accurate.
Right.
And that was a gift from the FBI to me because they were helping me put cell sites up in Moscow.
Right.
Just as a favor for being honest with them.
Yeah. Wow. You would have been, today's world, you would have been arrested long before.
Well, I would be considered a foreign agent, first of all, because I was financing foreign money.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah, the only time I felt fear was the time of the coup, when we didn't know which way it would turn out, and I was really very curious about that.
Right.
I took a photograph of myself in the mirror of my hotel room in Kazan, thinking it might be the last picture of me before I was dead. I felt that much fear. And my Soviet friends really felt the fear. They were just terrified of what could happen.
Right. And you had an actual plan how to get to Kazan, from Kazan to Istanbul.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I'm a survivor.
Yeah.
And and during that coup, the Sovitel office, I guess it was when Yeltsin was under siege in the White House there,
right,
in Moscow. There were bullets flying around the Ostankino Tower, and our Sovitel headquarters, our technical building, was a block from the Ostankino Tower, and there were bullets flying around our joint venture. Yeah.
Were you in the building at that time?
No, I wasn't there.
Yeah.
Also, I'll tell you just again another quick Russian story.
Yeah.
I flew back from Kazan when the coup guys were being arrested, and I was on a plane flying to Leningrad, where there was in the cabin a dog and a pig loose. And the toilet compressor at the back of the cabin exploded and put all this shit and piss into the aisles, and the dog and the pig were running back and forth, spreading it everywhere. Oh. This was on the flight back to Leningrad, an Aeroflot plane.
Oh my God.
So I got back, and I'm sitting with my kitchen staff and my other staff, and we're watching this funeral on Soviet TV of the 3 young men who died during that coup.
During that coup, yeah.
Yeah, and Russians always had a habit of listening to the radio while they were watching TV. They had the radio playing Radio Europe Plus, Radio Europe Plus.
Yeah.
And as the coffins are being lowered into the ground, comes on to the radio John Lennon singing Imagine.
Wow.
I wrote this up, and I sent this back to Diane and to Soros, and look what happened to me after this. That actually was a real experience to me. I could not believe. What is the nature of coincidence? I've had a lot of really inexplicable things happen in my life, but that was really unbelievable.
Yeah, that is unbelievable. I'll tell you just one quick personal story about the dog and the Aeroflot. In 1990, I flew from Moscow to Vladivostok, 9-hour flight. We got on the plane. Right behind us was a lady with a German Shepherd. In the row in front of us, she gets on, and the dog is in one of those seats. His paws over, looking down at me with dog breath and the whole thing. And then during the flight, he slept in the aisle. And in order to get to the bathroom, you had to kind of leverage yourself over the seats to get into the bathroom. But it was an amazing, but in that period of time, that wasn't so crazy,
You know, Diane and I were flying to Bulgaria once on an Aeroflot plane, and an old babushka was sitting next to us, and she took down the little tray,
Yeah.
and then pulled out a big piece of salami and a big knife, and she's cutting and she's making a meal. She eats her meal, and she goes to put the tray back up, and she couldn't figure out how to turn the little knob at the top.
Right.
And she looked at us, and she grabbed the tray, and she pulled it off the seat and threw it on the floor.
Wow. Wow.
We said, yeah, I hope the engines are better attached than the tray.
Yeah, really.
And then
Really?
one more quick Aeroflot flight. I'm flying back to Kazan, and the cabin was filled with mosquitoes. In any event, they're going to serve something. So we all take our trays down. They only have water. But they put down paper cups that were so thin that once you pour the water in, you couldn't pick it up because it would all spill out. So you had to bend over and lick it. So everybody on the flight was bent over licking like cats, licking water out of this full of paper cups.
Yeah. Unbelievable.
But we just adjusted to all of this stuff. And,
Yeah.
And somehow we made all these companies work.
Yeah, well, you adjusted and you didn't leave. And, there were so many people who I mean, when they would see these things and they'd say, just get me out of here. Just get me out of here.
I met many Western business people that said, we don't know how you have the stamina to put up with this. I said, because it's fun.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't no longer a hassle. It was fascinating.
Yeah.
That everything that was so broken could somehow be managed to, rejiggered to make something happen.
Right.
And we also felt our mission. We felt very clearly about our mission, that it was really helpful. And the very fact that we ended up being financially rewarded was a shock. That was we never thought in our whole life we would ever have any measure of wealth.
Yeah.
We never had. And that was not in any way in our mind when we started to do this work. It just, I didn't think myself capable of doing anything like that.
Yeah. You were always a technology person, though.
Not really. No, I did. I would hire people. I had the ideas of what I wanted to see happen, and then would hire the people to do it for me.
I see.
Like, I made the software company. I've never written a line of code in my life. I just knew what I wanted the software to do.
Okay.
I mean, I'm a vision guy, sort of.
Yeah.
And I didn't know anything about satellites or telecommunications at all.
But you had the vision and the drive to bring it to fruition.
That was it, yeah. And I would find people who would be eager to help.
Yeah. Interesting. And so if you were to say, what was the most important lesson you learned? Or no, let me put it this differently. In terms of the book that I'm preparing, what is the most important thing you would like to convey from your experience to people who would read a book about that period?
Well, it's a couple of things. First of all, the recognition that it's possible for a single individual to come up with a powerful idea, somehow assemble the resources, and bring it to life. Oh, then that brings me to another thing. I brought to George Soros's apartment in New York on Fifth Avenue once Boris Cherkov, who is the director of the Soviet. He ran the hotline to the White House in the Kremlin.
Yeah,
and he was really important, a telecommunications guy, and he said to Soros, because Soros says, I'm so impressed with your ability to describe things. Your vocabulary, your delivery is so eloquent. And he laughed and said, well, it's true for most Soviets. They've developed an incredible ability to describe things beautifully because for the most part, they never have the ability to make it happen. So they're judged on their ability to express using language. I thought that was a really interesting insight.
Yeah, yeah, it is.
But back to your question, to add to the fact that any individual is capable of coming into the most bizarre environment, but with an idea that's worthy. It's possible to just find the resources, solve problems as you go, and make a big difference. And it makes an even bigger difference when my motivation was to contribute to the reduction in the prospects of nuclear globular annihilation.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, talk about a motivation.
Yeah.
There were so many people in the citizen diplomacy movement who were traveling to Russia at that time, all for the same reason. They wanted to just lower the temperature.
Yeah. Yeah.
On our first trip to Moscow, to the Soviet Union in '83, you may remember the Soviets accidentally shot down an airliner over Korea.
Yeah. 007.
007. And on that was a congressman named McDonald. Funny, I remember his name. And for a few minutes, wrong information went to the Kremlin saying it wasn't a member of Congress, but dozens of members of US Congress. And they went into red alert thinking they may need to initiate first strike. That happened on my first trip. And then that story was corrected and the temperature then dropped again. And they realized it was a bad incident, but there was a miscommunication somewhere in the system.
Yeah.
And that was my very first trip. We almost were in the middle of, I don't know, conflagration.
Yeah. 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 So you considered yourself part of this whole citizen diplomacy movement at that time.
Yeah, I don't know what we didn't really, I mean, we weren't, it was not an organized movement. We were all separate people who,
right.
for various reasons, our friends, Kim and Evelyn, were doing, satellite connections. David Hoffman was developing Internews, and he was spending a lot of time in Russia. The Esalen people were working on a variety of projects. And I met a guy from Germany, Mickey Raymond, who was doing some incredible projects with the Russians. There was such a variety of activity going on.
Right. Did you meet Sharon Tennyson? Was she part of this?
Sure, she was part of the San Francisco-based group. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, there was that building that our friend Henry Dakin made kind of the headquarters for so many people.
Uh-huh.
And Henry was just a dear guy who, I'll send you a 5-minute video of my eulogy at Henry's memorial because it goes into the whole Russia thing.
Okay. Yeah, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, it was a really, I was really inspired because I loved Henry. Henry had Asperger's and was a Harvard graduate. He inherited all this money from the Dakin Toy Company, which was the largest stuffed animal company in the world. His mother, father, a bunch of cousins were killed in a plane crash, and Henry and his sisters inherited this money, and they didn't know what to do with it. And so he became this philanthropist.
Uh-huh.
And the variety of things that he funded were just mind-boggling. But he was especially interested in the Soviet dilemma.
Uh-huh.
And he, I explained in the eulogy how we met him and what he did. Sharon was part of that group, and Mark Graham, who had a small telecom company, is now director of the Wayback Machine at the Internet Archives in San Francisco. In fact, I just spoke with Mark yesterday. There were just a huge number of people, and Henry made office space available for everybody. And he put a dish on the roof, a satellite dish, aimed at the Soviet Molniya satellite. And he downloaded live Russia programming every day and made videotapes and would bring them over to the Soviet consulate in San Francisco as a gift so they could watch home television. And as a result, they gave us first priority in getting visas anytime we wanted to go.
Wow.
And So, but that was such an optimistic time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very optimistic.
We felt just nothing but rainbows and good news ahead.
Yeah.
So many people were spending more and more time, not so much the business people, but the citizen diplomats, just trying to make projects, two-way communication, school children talking to each other.
Right.
You know, I had a link from the Manege right next to the Kremlin of a video phone link with school kids from Berkeley and Moscow. And a guy from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said, well, what will these first graders say to each other? I said, excuse me, you're seriously telling me you're concerned about what first grade children are going to say to each other? Please, back away.
Wow. Wow.
I'll
Yeah,
give you one final story. We smuggled in a copying machine from Helsinki without declaring it by train. It was Henry Dakin who actually helped me bring that in. And I didn't declare it at customs, and it was in a box, and I just said it's nothing. And so we were using this copying machine in our office in Moscow and letting Joseph use it. So many Russians were using it. And one day a KGB officer came by. They found out about our copying machine. He was wearing a black leather coat. He was the vintage KGB guy.
Right.
And he says, you know, it's impossible. And meanwhile, our office manager, Galina Andreeva, was an attractive woman. And she realized there was a problem. So she started kind of flirting with him a little bit to distract him. And he says, besides, you need to be behind a steel door. And I called one of our office guys, Valery, bring me that aluminum Reynolds wrap roll over here and some push pins. And I took a closet door and we covered it with aluminum foil. And we put the copy machine in the closet behind this. I said, well, it's not a steel door. And meanwhile, Galina is still kind of flirting with the guy. And he said one of the most popular Russian phrases I heard all the time. I said, would this be okay? And he said, in principle, it's possible. In principle, it works.
Yeah.
And he left, and we kept the copy machine and on the door covered with aluminum foil. You know, it's like
principle. He said, principle. It's okay in principle.
In principle, that's right. It was. I heard that so often.
Yeah. I did too. Yeah.
And right opposite the Nipas, opposite their front door, was a very small Russian Orthodox church. And we had never been, on my first trip with Diane to the Nipas, we went into that church. And there were 3 events taking place in the same open room. There was a baby being baptized, there was a young couple being married, and there was a dead babushka on a slab.
Wow, the whole life.
A funeral, a baptism, and a marriage, all taking place with people lighting candles and Russian priests singing in deep voice, the whole cycle of life taking place in once. We were just stood there flabbergasted. It seemed so, in a way, normal to us.
Yeah.
In the big picture of the, you know, the mysteries of life.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess another thing working in Russia was that it was so different in cultural experience than anything we had grown up with, that we were just fascinated that this was a whole way of living that we just were completely unaware of.
Yeah.
And we discovered in having late night conversations, you know, with Russian friends, we would discuss subjects that I hadn't discussed since college, when your mind was like so curious, like what is the real nature of music? We would have talks like this, you know, and it was like, I would never have talks like that in San Francisco.
Yes. Yeah. I know what you mean. I do know what you mean. And as a result, you have the friendships that are deep and anchored in both emotions and intellect with those folks that you
That's
had.
right. Uh, Russian people were thinking at least as big or bigger than Americans. I mean, the really talented people, minds were incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, this guy Velikov was just incredible. You should check his, if you haven't already, check his Wikipedia page.
Okay.
Look at his background.
I will.
He's still alive. He had a stroke a few years ago. You know, and I could call, when I was back in America, I had to call him a couple of times. Like, I would wake him up in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
And instead of being upset with me for waking him up, he was so happy to hear from me. Yeah. John Scully called me from an airplane. He was flying over to Moscow with a group of Apple people to have a major proposal. Basically, they wanted to do the operating system in Cyrillic. And he called me from the airplane phone saying, I have a big favor to ask you. Each of us on this flight assumed that someone else had arranged visas. We have no visas to come into Moscow.
Oh my goodness.
What can you do for us? I said, well, I'll call Velikov and I'm sure he'll solve the problem. So I called Velikov. He said, they forgot their visas. Okay, you got their names? Okay, I gave him the names. He met them at the airport, went through customs, went to actually where they were getting off the plane.
Right.
Handed them their visas, and then they all went back in through customs.
Incredible. But yes, those are the things that happen.
Yeah, and Scully once said to me, you know, every time I log on to SFMT email to communicate with Moscow, I never take for granted what it must have taken for you to make this possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's to his credit. Yeah.
I was really impressed with that guy.
Yeah. Did they get the deal done?
No. Although iPhones are the most popular devices, all over the world.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, so the point that you made when I asked you about this is the impact that an entrepreneurial individual can make in the right circumstances. Is that a summary of what you would say is a most important thing?
Yeah, a lot of it is. I mean, I don't know how many definitions of the word luck you can make.
Yeah.
But our timing, in hindsight, turned out to be perfect. Although when I was involved in the activity, I wasn't even aware. I mean, oddly as it seems, I wasn't even aware of how lucky I was that everything was, that these intersections, and I would meet this guy and he would send me to here. It just seemed like it was just unfolding like a dance.
Yeah.
And as I look back on it, had I tried to do this 10 years earlier, it would have been impossible.
Yeah.
And I don't think I could have survived the corruption and the competition in the 90s.
Yeah.
Soros told me in no uncertain terms, because he was the money guy, don't do anything illegal because of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
Right.
Because he was the money, they would target him.
Right.
I would have been his agent doing something illegal.
Yes.
The only bribes I ever made were giving cartons of Marlboros to a really busy restaurant to get a table that was, unavailable.
Yeah. Right.
I would do little things like that, but never, ever do a bribe.
Yeah.
And people would make hints. We would say no.
Yeah.
But I mean, the power of the individual. I mean, I guess Margaret Mead has a famous quote about that. It's the only way anything has ever evolved in human society. It's the power of individual initiative.
Yeah.
It's really true.
Yeah. But in the right circumstance. Yeah.
And being open to network, because you never know To me, one of the great mysteries is who you're sitting next to on an airplane. That may give you a tip about something. You either act on it or you don't, and that changes the next level of options you have.
Right.
The next day, and that's true all the time.
Yeah.
You meet whether you decide I'm going to go with this guy or that guy.
Right. Yeah.
And who would believe trying to help a 6-year-old child prodigy pianist would end up introducing me to a guy like George Soros, and he would become the chief investor of the enterprise.
Yes. Right. Totally. It's not serendipity in a way, but I guess it is. And yeah.
I mean, we think about that a lot because we've had experiences in our life that are totally inexplicable in normal, rational terms.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, and Russians would say it was fate. Судьба.
Diane and I were talking to one of our dearest friends who passed a few years ago, Richard Kaplan. He was in Florida, and we were in California, and they have an apartment in New York. I said, we're flying to Moscow tomorrow, but we'll be coming back through New York in about a month. Where will you guys be? He said, well, we're flying to Rome, but we hope that we can connect back in New York. And we said, okay. So we flew to Frankfurt to change planes, and I went to a photo shop to buy film. This is the very next day, and I get a tap on the shoulder, and it's Richard.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, the day before, I was in California. He was in Florida. He was on his way to Rome. We were on our way to Moscow. Had I gone into that photo shop 10 minutes earlier or later, whatever, we wouldn't have. But what the hell is that?
Yeah. No. I
love it.
Right.
In our Russian experience, we had so much of that happen in Russia, where we just found ourselves being introduced to certain people. And
well, you had a certain advantage of, what, if you will, the first mover, being there at a time where they were looking for contacts. You were trustworthy. There weren't so many other people to talk to.
And also the big corporations seemed clueless. Like after we had a press conference when we announced Sovintel, the big telephone venture, the manager of AT&T came over to me and said, "How did you know there was an opportunity here?" And I said, "Excuse me, 300 million Russians and only 33 international trunk lines, and you don't see an opportunity?"
Yeah.
He said, "Well, we weren't thinking it was even possible to even try to do anything."
Right.
I mean, and that was a very honest statement. Corporately, they thought that was a dead end.
Yeah.
It would have been impossible use of their resources to try to come up with a digital international phone system.
Yeah.
And it turned out to be easy.
But it probably would have been a lot harder for them than for you.
That's right. And I told you earlier, because they would always send different people, and they would bog down and, inertia.
Yeah. Well, it's a fantastic episode and era. And you were a great pioneer for things that a real change in ability to communicate and relations between the two countries. So, I mean, it's fantastic. It's a great story.